Hello and welcome to my first YouTube video. In this video I want to look at some old server hardware that was going to be thrown away by the company I work for, so I decided to rescue it and see what can be done with it. It looks to be quite old and probably not very good, but this then gives us the opportunity to maybe upgrade it later. I'll be exploring this in the next video. This time I want to explore the hardware and see what it is and if we could potentially make use of it. What we have is a 2U rack mount chassis. 2U refers to the height. Server racks are measured in U's or rack units for the height and are typically 19 inches wide. As this is a server chassis and it's designed to run 24/7 365, it has a lot of very noisy fans in it, as the goal is to keep the components cool rather than worrying about noise. You'll hear these fans soon. Let's have a look at the front of the chassis and see what we have. The flap at the front is opened by undoing these two thumb screws and it just flips down. We have a power and reset buttons, two USB 2 ports, a 5¼ inch bay with a CD/DVD combo drive in, a 3½ inch bay for a floppy disk drive, common in older hardware, and finally on the left there is a panel that comes off so that we can clean the dust filters for the 3 internal cooling fans. Turning the case around to see the back and looking from left to right, we can see that it has a smaller power supply than you're probably used to seeing. This form factor is called 2U Industrial, I believe. And then looking at the ports, there is a green PS2 mouse connector, a purple PS2 keyboard connector, a DVI-D digital video output, a D-sub analog video output, 4 USB 2 ports, gigabit Ethernet and 3 audio input-output ports, a line-in, headphones and microphone. Finally, there are 7 half-height expansion slots, but I'm sure the motherboard inside won't have 7 slots. This is normal as it means the chassis can support many different motherboard form factors. 2 of the expansion slots don't have a blanking plate as the cards were removed before I got the chassis. The memory and hard drive were also removed, but I've installed some memory just so that I can power it on and get to the BIOS. Let's have a look inside to see the hardware. To get the lid off, there are 8 screws to be undone. 4 little screws on the top at the front, 2 on the left and another 2 on the right hand side. So let's get the lid off and have a look inside. There are 3 fans to provide cooling for the motherboard and other internal components. They are powered using old Molex connectors and are daisy chained together. This means that they run full speed all the time. I will look to potentially replace these with some better and quieter fans that can connect to the motherboard fan headers. This means that the speed and thus the noise can be controlled according to thermals. At the front of the chassis on the left there are 2 3½ inch bays for hard disks. On the right there is a 3½ inch bay for a floppy disk drive, and below that a 5¼ inch bay for a CD/DVD drive. Looking at the motherboard expansion slots, there's a PCI Express by 16 slot and 2 PCI Express by 1 slots. The slot on the right is designed to support any size card as the back of the slot is removed. Most PCI Express cards will work in a smaller slot, but you won't necessarily get the full performance from the card. There are 2 DDR3 DIMM slots. I've already populated them with 2 lots of 8 gig DIMMs, making a total of 16 gigabytes. Looking at the CPU, we can see there's a little fan on top of a small copper heatsink. On the right hand side you can see the power supply and it's a server form factor. At 400 watts it's not powerful, but looking at the small CPU cooler the system probably doesn't draw much power. There are 2 SATA cables, one for the original hard drive which was removed and one for the optical drive. I disconnected the optical drive as I won't be using it. There are a lot of Molex connectors which shows that the power supply and probably the whole system is old. There's one 8-pin power connector and the 24-pin power connector for the motherboard. 2 USB ports, the speaker, and then you have the power, reset and hard disk activity light connector headers. An additional CPU power connector on the motherboard over here. As this is a server, the excess cabling is tied down, which I'll remove in time because we're not going to need them. I'm going to put a small SATA 2 SSD in the floppy disk drive bay so that I can boot the system up, install a few operating systems on to investigate and benchmark the hardware. The motherboard is an Asus H61M-F and is USB 3 capable, but I didn't see the USB 3 ports on the front or the back. There is a USB 3 header on the motherboard itself, but the chassis doesn't have any compatible ports. It also supports PCI Express Gen 3. Let's power on the device and go into the BIOS to have a look at what system we have and see all of the options that there are. This will show us what CPU we have and how much memory is present. These three chassis fans and the PSU fan are very noisy, so I've muted the audio, otherwise you won't be able to hear anything. The warning message we see here can be ignored for now as we don't have an operating system installed yet. I'll press F1 to enter the BIOS. One of the first things I want to do is change the number lock option, as the keyboard I'm using, the number keys are on the normal keys, and this stops me from using the keyboard properly. This is a common option in the BIOS and is normally found within the boot options menu. We'll go there now and find the option for boot up numlock state and set it to off. This will now stop the numlock from turning on every time the system is turned on. Let's have a look at the system details on the main menu. From the BIOS date, we can see that this system is over 10 years old. It has a very low powered CPU, the Intel i3-2120. This is a second generation Core i CPU and will be very slow by modern standards, so I doubt we'll get much out of this one. One of the uses for this machine was as a hypervisor, and it was going to go into one of my 19-inch racks. I'll create another video showing my home rack setup and what services I run. As the CPU is so old and underpowered, I'm not sure how well it will actually run any VMs. We'll also need to check if it supports virtualization. This option will likely be in the advanced menu. I'll go through all the BIOS options and turn on or off any that I feel need changing. The BIOS is a complicated thing and I could make a whole video just about that. If there is anything interesting or needs explaining, I'll show you. Hyperthreading is turned on. CPU virtualization is turned on. I want to turn on PXE. APM, I want this on. If the server loses power, when the power comes back on, it will automatically turn itself on. This is especially important if the server is hosting other services or running virtual machines. I'll turn on the option to allow the server to be turned on by a PCI Express device. The BIOS supports firmware flashing, so I'll go online and see if there is a new firmware for this motherboard. The current version is at the bottom, which is currently 2.10.1208. Now I want to save all the changes, so I'll press F10 to save, yes to save the configuration. The machine will automatically reboot and I'll turn it off once the BIOS warning message appears. Let's see how much power is drawn when turning the server on. 62 to 63 watts is quite a lot for something of this spec. I'm going to disconnect the power supply fan as it makes most of the noise, and we'll see how this affects the power draw. While a benchmark is being run, the power draw goes up to over 80 watts. As you can see, the power draw has gone down by only 2 to 3 watts. This is a lot less than I was expecting, but the three fans inside should provide some cooling for the power supply, but over time it might not be enough. I've run some long CPU and GPU benchmarks with the fan disconnected and the thermals have been fine, but I'm not going to run the server like this when it's deployed. I'll definitely get a new power supply. Going into the BIOS again, I have managed to update it to the latest version. This wasn't as easy as it should have been, as the utility in the BIOS itself can't be used to update it with the versions of the BIOS available from Asus's website. I'll wrap up this by saying thank you to everyone for watching. This is my first time trying to edit a video. I've learnt a lot and I'm hoping to try some actual transitions or effects next time. In the next video I'll be looking at what hardware I got to upgrade this server and why I picked it. Please leave a comment if you have any suggestions for future videos. Like and subscribe and all that jazz.